My wife ignored me for 20 days. On the 21st, I left a box of chocolates in the room and a handwritten letter, "Thank you for all these years. And this time, I want to make it the most special year of my life." I closed the door behind me, grabbed my suitcase, and left without yelling, without crying, without slamming the door, without making a fuss, just with silence. The same silence she'd given me for almost a whole month. But mine was different. My silence was a goodbye. She only noticed when there was no one else in the house to ask if she was okay, if she wanted dinner, if she needed anything. When he went to bed at night and his side of the bed was cold. When she smelled the perfume I'd purposely left on the pillow, like someone giving me one last invisible hug before disappearing. There was no betrayal with kisses or touches, but there was betrayal with absence, with contempt, with neglect. And these are the ones that hurt the most, because no one sees, no one notices, no one defends you. I was betrayed by the indifference of someone I swore to love for life. Betrayed by a deafening silence while I begged for a gesture. For 20 nights I tossed and turned in bed alone, trying to understand the moment I stopped being seen. Trying to remember the exact point at which love became furniture. I existed inside, breathing the same air, walking through the same house, and yet it was as if I were no longer there. I heard her cutlery clatter against the plate as I tried to make conversation. I heard my phone vibrate with messages from someone who made her smile when I could barely manage a "good night." And the worst part? I stayed there. I kept waking up before her just to make coffee. I kept reminding her of the medication schedule she always forgot. I kept saying, "Get well," even when I was the one who wasn't well. And she, nothing. No reaction. No look. I know, maybe I should have confronted her, demanded an explanation, asked the reason for the distance. But I didn't want to hear from her that she was with someone else. That I wasn't enough. That I no longer made sense. So I chose to leave the chocolates. And disappear. She only realized everything when she found the letter. And then it was as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Not because the letter was sad. But because it was love. A love that endured until the end. A love that didn't shout, didn't demand, didn't point a finger. A love that didn't deserve to be ignored. And she understood, too late, that this was the cruelest goodbye of all, to the man who still loved her, but who gave up fighting because he fought alone. She started looking for me. Through messages. Through connections. Even through mutual friends. But I was already far away. Not just in miles. I was far from everything that hurt me, from everything that shrank me. I had stopped being half of myself to find myself whole again. And I did. In someone who wasn't afraid to look me in the eyes. Who listened even to what I didn't say. Who understood my silences as if they were sentences. Who laughed at my jokes and cried with my memories. It was different. Light. Real. But the heart isn't a switch. I still thought about the woman I left. Not because I wanted to go back, but because it still hurt. Sometimes love ends without ending. It just changes form. It becomes longing, it becomes regret, it becomes a lesson. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted her to understand what she lost. Not out of pride. But because loving someone requires more than a physical presence. It requires a soul, eyes, hands, listening. And she didn't give me any of that. One day, months later, she found me. She was thinner, her face haggard, her eyes red from crying. She looked at me as if she'd seen a ghost, as if she couldn't believe I still existed outside of her world. And when she tried to speak, her voice wouldn't come out. Until she broke down. "I'm sorry. Please. I didn't know I was losing you. I thought you'd never leave." I listened. Really. Without interrupting. Without judging. And then I said. "I thought it never would either." She cried. I didn't. Because in that moment, I realized I had forgiven. Not for her. But for myself. Because forgiving isn't about going back. It's about moving on. It's about accepting that sometimes we do everything right, but even then, it's not enough for those who can no longer see. After that, I kept going. I didn't look back. She did. She stood there, her eyes empty and her hands trembling, as if trying to hold back time with her fingers. But time, it had already taken everything. Including me. And the cruelest part of all this isn't the end. It's what happens afterward. It's her living each day, trying to return to the places where we were happy. Trying to hear the songs I sang in the car. Trying to remember the sound of my voice. Trying to find some trace of me in the memories she herself erased. But memories don't respond to messages. And the silence, now, is hers. She started dreaming about me. Almost every night. And in the dreams, I was still there. But always in the same places where she'd ignored me. On the couch, calling for a chat. In the kitchen, trying to share dinner. On the balcony, waiting for her to notice me. And in the dreams, she did things differently. She hugged me. She listened to me. She apologized. But she always woke up with her face wet with tears and a pain in her chest that wouldn't go away. Because there, in the empty bed, there was no one on the other side. No letter. No perfume. No chocolates. Only silence. A silence that screamed everything she refused to hear. She understood, too late, that love isn't killed all at once. It's killed little by little. With absences. With carelessness. With silence. And that's exactly what she did. She killed the love of a man who just wanted to stay. But what she never knew, is what I wrote on the back of the letter. The one she only read when she desperately sought me out and returned to my room days later, rummaging through drawers. On the back of the letter, a phrase she never forgot: if you ever look for me and I'm no longer there, it's because I've finally learned to love myself more than I loved you. And that's exactly what happened. But the story, the real story, the one that explains everything that led up to this point, she doesn't know yet. And maybe, if you listen to the end, you'll find out along with her. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or condoned, quite the opposite. All stories are fictional, but each carries a painful truth: betrayal destroys, corrodes, and leaves scars that time doesn't always heal. Our goal is clear: to show that those who play with love will one day silently witness the price of their own choice. Get ready. What you're about to hear is not just a story. It's a reality check. They met on an ordinary day, the kind you swear you'll forget, but then become a milestone without realizing it. It was in a corner cafe, at a crossroads of chance and destiny, and although neither believed in coincidences, something about that encounter made them pause. His name was Daniel, hers was Sophia. He was a financial analyst, disciplined enough to smile. She was an architect, with a detailed look in her eyes, like someone who sees beauty even in things that are already broken. It wasn't love at first sight, but there was a silence between them that rang louder than any prepared phrase. And that silence made them want to stay. They started with short coffees and long conversations, and before they knew it, they already knew each other's parents' names, their childhood fears, their untold traumas, their irritating quirks, and their most secret dreams. It didn't take long for them to fall in love, because with them, everything happened with both calm and intensity. Daniel was always a man of gestures more than words. He didn't know exactly how to verbalize what he felt, but he made a point of showing it. He had a quiet delicacy, like when he left a note on the refrigerator door with the weather forecast and a reminder to bring her umbrella, or when he came home with food already prepared just because he knew she'd had a hard day. Sophia, on the other hand, was a man of words, but she didn't always use them as she should. Sometimes, she held back too much. Other times, she spoke impulsively. But she loved. She loved with her eyes, with her tired body that still curled up against his at night, with her creative mind that designed her future child's room even though she wasn't sure she wanted one. They were the balance of a beautiful chaos. He was routine, she was improvisation. He was practical, she was emotion. And, for a time, that was enough. They lived in a simple apartment, but full of history. Every object there had a why and a where it came from. The bookshelf was assembled with laughter one morning when nothing fit together. The kitchen table was a gift from her father, restored by him with white paint and patience. The living room curtains were bought on a trip together, after a silly argument that ended in laughter and promises. Their home was more than walls, it was a living memory of what they had built. There was no luxury, but there was presence. And presence, these days, is almost a luxury too. For the first 3 years, everything seemed to fit together. They had disagreements like any couple, but nothing that lasted. They always ended arguments with some kind gesture or a conversation on the living room floor, with cheap wine and honest truths. Close friends admired them, saying they had a rare connection, the kind you don't see often. Daniel has always valued stability. Raised by a single mother who fought for everything, he learned early on not to waste what he had. That's why, when he met someone like Sophia, who understood his silences and embraced his quirks, he gave himself completely. He was the kind of man who organized the bills on Sunday but left flowers on Monday just to remind her that the details still mattered. Sophia was freer, less attached to the order of things. Sometimes she forgot important dates, but she never forgot how he liked his coffee, nor the movies that made him cry in secret. She had the kind of emotional intelligence that knows when to shut up, when to embrace, when to provoke. And even through their differences, they found a kind of fit that made sense. Their life together wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was theirs. Mornings usually began with Daniel waking up first, making coffee, and reading the news. Sophia came later, her hair messy and eyes half closed, looking for him with a lazy smile. They shared the newspaper, commented on the absurdities of the world and the small dramas of the day. Sometimes they talked about the future. Other times, they just looked at each other silently, as if they'd already said it all. Routines were built this way, with affection that made no noise. With complicity that needed no explanation. With love that, even on bad days, remained. But time, the one we so underestimate, began to act as it does with almost everything, wearing us down. It wasn't something that happened suddenly. It was a build-up. One day he came home from work and she wasn't there. Then, she began to be absent even when she was. Physically present, emotionally distant. Conversations diminished, laughter became rarer, and the silences, once comfortable, now weighed heavily. But it was still nothing concrete. There were still dinners, there were still touches, there were still kisses. But not the same ones. And, most importantly, not in the same way. Daniel felt it. But he didn't say it. Sophia noticed. But she didn't say it either. And in this abyss of omissions, the relationship began to weaken. He noticed details that hadn't existed before. Her cell phone was always face down. The messages exchanged with someone she called just a friend. Her disinterest in talking about his day. And yet, he tried not to assume the worst. Because love is also this, it's doubting yourself before doubting the other. Sophia, for her part, was going through an internal turmoil. She had existential crises, insecurities about her own career, a feeling of dissatisfaction that even she couldn't explain. She could no longer see herself as she used to, nor find herself in Daniel's eyes. And she began to pull away. Not out of malice, not out of disrespect, but because she couldn't cope. And as she pulled away, he moved closer. The more she remained silent, the more he tried to make noise with gestures. They began to live on different frequencies. They were in the same space, but in different times. Daniel tried to maintain his routine, but felt that what existed between them was no longer mutual. And Sophia, immersed in herself, didn't realize how much he lost himself trying to keep her there. There were no fights. There were no screams. There was only this growing emptiness that no one named. And that's where the danger lies. When no one has the courage to say what's hurting, the pain finds other ways to manifest. Even so, Daniel didn't give up. He persisted with small invitations, a dinner out, a quick trip, a movie on the couch. And she almost always declined. She claimed fatigue, commitments, a headache. But he persisted. Because he still loved her. Because he still believed. Because he still hoped. And she, without realizing it, began to grow accustomed to this love that was always there, even when she didn't reciprocate. She began to think it was normal to be loved effortlessly. And, in her comfort zone, she lost track of how much she was destroying someone who only wanted to stay. The days passed. The months too. And everything changed. The messages that once came with hearts became dry. The "I love you"s became fewer. The nights together became separate. And still, Daniel didn't give up. Because when you truly love someone, you hold on to even what hurts you, hoping it will get better. But love, no matter how strong, also has a limit. And that limit silently approaches when we realize we're fighting alone for two. The house that had once been a shelter now felt like a neutral space. The smell of coffee was no longer the same. The flowers he still bought began to wilt more quickly. The dinner he lovingly prepared often sat untouched on the table. And Sophia, even seeing all this, seemed distant. Daniel began to write. It was the only way to vent. In old notebooks, I wrote what I couldn't say. Words about longing, about emptiness, about the pain of feeling invisible. And there, on paper, he began to find himself again. He began to understand that love must be mutual. That love, when left untended, dies slowly. That's how history began to change. Not with a bang. But with silence. Not with a revealed betrayal, nor with a desperate cry, but with the slow death of a bond that had once been a shelter and was now just structure. The pieces were being moved. Fate was already beginning to prepare its own paths. But there was still time. There was still space. There was still silence waiting to be broken. But no one did. And what came next would change everything forever. Daniel began to observe everything in silence. Every movement, every new habit, every seemingly innocent excuse. It wasn't a mistrust out of nowhere, it was intuition mixed with the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers even when he tried to hold on with both hands. What had once been a relationship based on exchanges, routines, and small gestures now felt like a one-sided game. Sophia was there, but she wasn't anymore. Her body was still present, but her eyes, her attention, her desires, they all seemed distant, as if they had moved to another place where he was no longer invited. Conversations became shallow, affection became absent, and the smile that once came easily now seemed like an effort. Even so, Daniel remained there, trying, even when everything around him screamed at him to stop. Sometimes he felt ridiculous, but not for loving, for continuing to bet on someone who no longer bet on him. The changes came in small doses, but with a cumulative effect. She started arriving late. First, it was traffic. Then, long meetings. Eventually, the excuse became a habit. The notifications on her phone increased, and she began answering them away from him, in another room, saying it was work or a friend going through a difficult time. She, who previously couldn't go a night without lying on his chest, now slept facing the other side, clutching her own pillow. He noticed everything. But he still tried not to believe it. He still insisted on telling himself it was a phase, that she needed space, that perhaps she was facing some personal crisis. He tried to build bridges. He suggested couples therapy. She refused. Said she didn't see the need. But the look he gave her at that moment was more distant than any answer. His birthday dinner was the first moment her absence was too loud to ignore. She forgot. Or claimed to have. Daniel prepared his own dinner, alone, after arriving home with a grocery bag in the false hope that she was waiting with a surprise. She arrived at almost 11 o'clock at night, with disheveled hair and a forced smile, saying she was exhausted. He masked the pain with an even faker smile, saying it was okay, that it had been a long day. But that night, he slept with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for answers from a place that no longer spoke to him. The following days were a test of endurance. Daniel would wake up with a knot in his chest, go to work with his thoughts disorganized, and return home hoping, albeit silently, that something would change. But it didn't. Sophia grew more distant, colder, more and more enveloped in a world he no longer belonged to. He began to feel like an intruder in his own house, an unwanted guest in a home he'd helped build. The bed seemed bigger, the sofa emptier, and the music she played on Sundays was now different, a playlist he didn't recognize. The taste changed. The smell changed. The touch was lost. And yet, it remained. Daniel started taking walks in the late afternoon, more as an escape than for health. He needed to breathe, to think, to find himself. And it was on one of these walks, passing the bookstore they used to go to together, that he realized it wasn't just a phase. He saw Sophia enter, smiling, her face alight, like he hadn't seen in a long time. But she wasn't alone. A man was with her. The way she looked at him, the light laugh that escaped as he whispered something in her ear, the hand she rested on his arm, it was all too intimate to be friendship. Daniel froze. Time stood still for a few seconds. And then everything fell into place, like a cruel puzzle whose pieces he'd been trying to ignore. There was no scandal, no persecution. He simply turned and walked back, his stomach churning and his mind silent. When he got home that night, Sophia was already there, acting as if nothing had happened. Daniel watched her. He sat at the table and watched her while she played with her phone. She didn't even notice. And it was then that he understood, with a silent pain, that the love he carried was no longer enough for them both. She had made her choice, even if she didn't yet have the courage to admit it. He didn't ask. He didn't confront her. He just watched. And, inside, something began to die. In the following days, Daniel continued to act normally. He made coffee, washed the dishes, left for work. But inside him, everything had changed. Her presence now hurt him. Her scent bothered him. Her voice seemed to echo within an irreversible void. But he didn't yell. He didn't fight. He didn't demand. Instead, he began to write more. He spent sleepless nights, pouring out on paper everything he could no longer say out loud. He tried to remember where he had gone wrong, what he had missed. But the more he wrote, the more he realized that the problem wasn't that he wasn't trying enough, it was that she wasn't willing anymore. A week later, when he arrived home from work, Daniel quietly entered the house. And that's when he heard a muffled laugh coming from the bedroom. He walked slowly, and before turning the doorknob, he stopped. He heard her voice. She wasn't talking to him. Her tone was sweet, intimate, and devoted. She said she missed him, talked about the time they'd spent together, their plans, how he made her feel alive. And at the end of the conversation, she said something that sunk deep into Daniel's chest: he doesn't notice anything. He still thinks everything's fine. Daniel didn't enter the room. He didn't make a fuss. He went downstairs, left, and walked for hours, aimlessly. When he returned, she was already asleep. And he wasn't the same. That night, he wrote the letter. And with it, he also left the chocolates. A symbolic gesture from someone he still loved, but who could no longer bear the weight of a dead relationship alone. In the following days, he distanced himself. He created routines outside the house, slept on the couch, avoided eye contact. And she didn't notice. Or pretended not to notice. It was as if all that silence didn't matter. But to him, every silence from her was a scream. Every absence, a push. Every indifference, a new wound. It wasn't until the 21st day that he decided. He packed his suitcase, left the letter on the table next to the chocolates, and left. Not with anger. Not with hate. But with a silent and definitive goodbye. He didn't want to shout. He just wanted her to feel the weight of his absence. He wanted her to understand, too late, what she had lost. That love doesn't die all at once, but it does die. And when it dies, it doesn't come back. And she only realized this, when she read the letter. Sophia woke that morning with the smell of coffee still lingering in the air, but the house sounded different. Too quiet. She walked to the living room, still drowsy, expecting to find Daniel sitting with the newspaper, as he did every day. But the armchair was empty. The cup still sat on the coffee table, but it was cold. A white envelope rested on the kitchen table, with her name handwritten on it. And next to it, a box of chocolates she hadn't seen since the first time he surprised her on their anniversary, so many years ago. It didn't seem like a romantic gesture. It had a weight she couldn't immediately explain. She sat hesitantly and opened the letter. He read slowly, as if trying to delay the impact of the words. As I absorbed each sentence, my stomach began to churn. This was a goodbye. A silent goodbye, without shouting, without accusations, without drama, but devastating. It was the end of everything that had once been their safe haven. She held the letter with trembling hands, her eyes flooded. You tried calling him. No signal. His cell phone was off. She ran through the rooms of the house as if he were just playing hide-and-seek. But he wasn't. In the early days, she tried to hold her ground. She sent short messages, saying she needed to talk. Then came the desperate, regretful audio messages, begging for a chance, for a meeting, for an answer. But he didn't respond. Her silence, ignored for so long, now returned like an echo. Everything she had given in absence, she now received in the form of indifference. It was only then that she understood the magnitude of what she had lost. Not just a man. But the only one who saw her whole. The only one who remained even when she no longer deserved it. And now, there was no one else. Sophia began walking the streets as if searching for pieces of him in the places they used to pass. She visited cafes, entered bookstores, and spent hours in silence in the square where he liked to stroll. Each step was a plunge into memories that now hurt more than they soothed. The world seemed to have lost its color. The days dragged on. Her sleep was light, tormented by dreams that always had the same tone, her trying to reach him, but he always left. She woke crying, almost always in the middle of the night, her chest tight with a guilt that was already part of her. She tried to get her life back on track, to focus on work, on her friends, but everything seemed insipid. The messages stopped. So did the attempts. And she finally understood, he wasn't coming back. Months passed before fate crossed their paths again. Sophia wasn't expecting it. She was walking into the restaurant they used to frequent, now alone, when she saw him. He was sitting with another woman. He was laughing. He held her hand across the table with a naturalness that hurt. His eyes, previously dull at her side in recent months, now shone with a new light. Sophia froze. She considered leaving. But she stayed. She wanted to see. She needed to see. She sat in the far corner, ordering anything just to justify her presence there. And no matter how hard she tried to look away, her eyes kept returning to him. It was then that he saw her. She knew the instant his gaze met hers. For a second, everything stopped. But he just nodded politely and returned his attention to the woman in front of him. That killed her more than any confrontation. Because there was no hurt in his gaze. There was overcoming. Peace. It was as if she was no longer part of his story. And that was cruel. Devastating. She had become history. That night, she returned home distraught. And, as so many times before, he turned to the only place where he could vomit his pain unfiltered, his own conscience. He reread the letter. He sat on the bedroom floor. He cried until he couldn't breathe anymore. And, almost without thinking, he opened the drawer where he kept some old things. He found one of Daniel's old diaries. One of those he used to jot down loose sentences, thoughts, pieces of himself that no one else read. And it was there, amidst scribbles and jumbled words, that she found what she never expected. The secret that would destroy her forever. In the pages of that diary were the accounts of the days he pretended not to know. Every observation, every hour she was away, every detail of her behavior over the past few months. He knew. He always knew. But he didn't say it. He wrote it down. And more than that, there were the dreams. Or rather, the nightmares. Daniel had begun to dream about her. Repeated dreams. He would see her sitting at the table, her back to him, while he spoke and she didn't listen. In another dream, he would enter the house and find her laughing with another man. In the most recurring of all, he would try to hold her hand, but she would pull away, her face averted, as if she no longer recognized him. And in the dreams, she always turned away at the end, always crying, saying the same words, "I didn't know how to listen to you." But the most painful part wasn't in the dreams. It was in a letter she never received. A letter he wrote to himself, on the last day before he left. In the letter, he said he no longer felt anger or hatred. He felt grief. Because he had lost someone who was still alive. He said her betrayal wasn't physical, or not only, but emotional. That the betrayal was the slow abandonment, the neglect of words, the affection directed to another while he silently begged for a gesture. And worst of all, he didn't hate her. He still loved her when he left. But he chose to leave out of self-love. And at the end of the letter, a short but definitive sentence, "If she ever dreams of me, it's because my absence has finally made its presence felt." Sophia dropped the letter to the floor. She felt her body tremble. Because she'd been dreaming about him for weeks. Strangely real dreams. In the same places. With the same gestures. The same words. And now it all made sense. She'd ignored all the signs. She'd remained silent when he'd asked for her presence. She'd betrayed a love that only wanted to stay. And worst of all, he'd known all along. He didn't need proof. He didn't need to catch her. He just knew. He felt. And yet, he stayed, until he couldn't anymore. The next morning, she tried to find him. Not to ask to come back. But to apologize. She needed to look him in the eyes and tell him everything she hadn't had the courage to. She arranged a meeting. He accepted. And when she arrived, she saw him across the table, different. Not physically, but energetically. He no longer belonged in that chapter. He was whole. She was gone. She tried to smile, but her voice was choked. She said it wouldn't be long. That she only wanted to say one thing. And then, with tears in her eyes, she confessed, "I dreamed about you. 4 weeks. And in the dreams, you were leaving." He looked at her calmly. As if he already knew. As if he had waited for that moment not out of desire, but for closure. And he replied, his voice firm, "You started dreaming, the day you woke up. But it was too late." She cried. She apologized. She didn't ask for anything back. She knew she couldn't. And then he stood up. He touched her shoulder lightly. And before he left, he said with the most painful softness ever spoken, "I forgive you. But I'm not coming back. Because those who love and don't care, lose. And I am no longer yours." And then he was gone. And for the first time, she understood the silence. His silence. The silence that screamed everything she refused to hear. She sat there for long minutes after he left, staring into space, as the coffee cooled and the people around her went on with their lives, oblivious to the turmoil exploding within her. The world moved on with the same indifference she treated it with in the last few months they'd been together. Now she was the one feeling the weight of his absence, the chill of the empty table, the echo of her own guilt. There was no going back. No part of her still believed she could undo what had happened. Because, for the first time, she clearly saw the difference between a mistake and a choice. She hadn't made a mistake. She'd made choices, day after day, always pushing further away, always pushing the limits of someone who simply wanted to stay. And now, even without a scream, even without any revenge, she was destroyed. Because the cruelest punishment wasn't that he left, but that he left in peace, while she was left shattered, clinging to what could no longer be mended. The weeks that followed were a series of meaningless days. Sophia began to miss work more than was acceptable, and she began avoiding friends, even her closest ones. She didn't want to answer questions, she didn't want to explain. The pain inside her was too intimate, too shameful to share. She spent her nights awake, staring at the walls of her room as if she might find some answer there. The dreams didn't stop. They came even more vividly, more constantly. She dreamed of Daniel in detail, the texture of his skin, the timbre of his voice, his calm eyes, his simple gestures. But in her dreams, as in life, he always left. And when she woke, she cried silently, because understanding that she had lost him was unbearable. But accepting that she had lost him forever was pure hell. One afternoon, impulsively, she went to the building where he had moved. She found out the new address through a mutual friend who, hesitantly, ended up revealing it. Once there, she hesitated for several minutes at the reception desk. She felt like an intruder, an unwelcome presence, but she couldn't leave without at least trying to see him one more time. She asked to leave a letter. Nothing special, just a few handwritten words. The doorman, already familiar with Daniel and his reserved demeanor, refused. He said he had left clear instructions that he didn't want to receive personal correspondence from anyone he hadn't authorized. That was like a stone in her stomach. She thanked him, swallowed hard, and got back in the car, trying to hold back her tears. The world seemed increasingly closed to her, as if all doors were now locked with the key of regret. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life. Not without pain, but with determination. He found shelter in books, in friends, in work. And, little by little, he also found a new kind of silence in someone else, not the kind that screams, but the kind that welcomes. He met Clara in a short creative writing course. She was quiet, soft-spoken, with a look that seemed to hear before he even opened his mouth. She wasn't explosive, nor exaggerated. She had the right rhythm of someone who's unhurried but knows exactly where she wants to be. Little by little, Daniel let Clara in. Without comparisons, without burden. He didn't want to replace her. He just wanted to feel like he could be seen again. And she saw him. In the details. In the way he hesitated before talking about you. In the way he looked out the window whenever they brought up topics from the past. She listened to him with her eyes, with her skin, with her entire presence. And he felt it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could be loved again, without begging for space, without begging for attention. One of those days, Clara took him to a park she loved. They said a few words, walked hand in hand, sat on the grass, and remained silent for a while. It was he who broke the silence, saying, almost in a whisper, that he had once loved someone he didn't know how to care for. Clara didn't ask for names or details. She simply said, sometimes, love doesn't end. It just changes homes. Daniel smiled, squeezed her hand, and understood that he was ready to start over. Unhurriedly, without guilt, but with truth. As Daniel continued on, Sophia sank. Not in anger. But in conscience. It was one random morning, after another sleepless night, that she decided to visit his father. She wanted to deliver the letter in person, perhaps hoping that he, the man who knew her so well, could intercede in some way. Daniel's father received her politely, but without the same warmth as before. He said he forgave her, but that his forgiveness was meaningless. "It was my son you hurt, not me. And well, he's already in another stage of life. You know, my daughter, sometimes we only understand the value of love when we lose someone who should never have left." Those words echoed for days. Sophia, searching for some peace, began to write. Perhaps inspired by the notebooks Daniel left behind. She began to recount every memory, every moment that hurt today, every detail she'd ignored at the time. It was an attempt to release what no longer fit inside. An emotional exorcism. And there, among so many written words, something she'd never imagined began to emerge, a true understanding of who she was and what she'd done. No frills. No excuses. Just naked truths, exposed, bleeding onto the paper. One night, without planning, he went to the same bookstore where everything had begun to fall apart. He didn't know exactly why. He just went. And there, among the shelves and souvenirs, he saw Daniel again. He was with Clara, laughing at something she had said. They both seemed light. Real. And for a moment, Sophia felt envious, not of the woman, but of the lightness. Because the last time she had felt this way had been with him, many years before. Daniel saw her. He didn't look away. He gave a slight nod. She nodded back. There was no more pain in his eyes. Only distance. And it was in that moment that she understood that the forgiveness he had given her wasn't a way to return. It was the final door that was closing. When she left, the world seemed clearer. Not lighter, but truer. What remained now was to move on. Not to forget, she knew she would never be able to, but to carry the pain as part of who she had become. Because betrayals aren't just acts. They're also silences. Distances. Presences that don't listen. And that was all she was. Today, Daniel walked hand in hand with someone who knew how to see in him everything she once ignored. And she walked alone, her steps marked by everything she chose not to care about. Months later, Daniel published a book. A compilation of chronicles about absences, silences, and new beginnings. The book was a success. It became a bestseller. In interviews, he never mentioned names. But he spoke of the love that was lost through carelessness. He spoke of forgiveness. He spoke of self-love. And one day, during a live interview, he was asked if he still loved the woman who inspired much of the book's pages. He smiled sweetly, looked into the camera, and replied, "I still do. But it's a love that no longer hurts. It's a love that taught me to love myself first." Sophia watched this interview alone, sitting on the couch in the house where it all began. She cried. For the last time. And then, in a silent gesture, she closed her laptop, picked up the notebook where she was writing, and wrote just one sentence: "May I never love again as I loved you, but may one day I love with the same truth with which you loved me." Because the true punishment for betrayal doesn't always come from the loss of the other person, but from the moment you realize that the person you destroyed was the only one willing to rebuild everything with you. The days that followed Daniel's interview were long and silent for Sophia. She no longer cried the same way, not because she had overcome it, but because the pain had transformed. It was no longer a desperate cry for him to return, but rather a constant, silent presence that accompanied every gesture, every choice, every attempt to move forward. It was a mature, resigned grief that no longer expected rewards or reversals. She understood that the love she lost would not return, and worse, that the love she received was the purest anyone could have offered, and that through carelessness, inattention, and selfishness, she slowly let it die, like someone who forgets to water the only plant capable of bearing fruit. Now, all that remained was the dry soil and the weight of the memory of what could have blossomed if she had chosen to stay when there was still time. It was in this context that Sophia began writing her own story, not out of vanity or a desire to be read, but as a way to understand herself. She needed to understand the exact point at which she stopped listening, the moment she began to take love for granted, as if it were the other person's obligation to stay even when everything inside her begged for help. And by revisiting her own mistakes with brutal honesty, she found not only the woman she once was, but the one she never wanted to become. It wasn't just about Daniel, it was about everything she lost by failing to care. Friends who drifted away because they saw what she pretended not to see. The respect of his family, who now treated her with polite coldness. Her own reflection, which now couldn't hold her gaze in the mirror for long. While she immersed herself in this solitary process of inner reconstruction, Daniel was experiencing a new moment. He had released another book, this time lighter, with stories inspired by new beginnings, unlikely encounters, and possible loves. His relationship with Clara matured with the delicacy of someone who has suffered too much to waste what they have. It wasn't a movie love, the kind that comes with background music and grandiose promises. It was a silent, daily love, made of care, patience, and real presence. They shared simple mornings, short trips, laughter in cafes, comfortable silences. Daniel no longer spoke of the past. He kept what he experienced with Sophia in a place of learning. It hurt less, but it still existed. Because true loves don't fade, they just change places within us. Sophia tried going out a few times, meeting new people, allowing herself to experience something new. But every attempt felt shallow, as if what she sought wasn't exactly new love, but a kind of redemption no other person could offer. She still carried within her the version of Daniel who loved her, and it was against that memory that she compared every new smile. No hug felt right, no voice soothed, no conversation flowed as before. It wasn't because the others were bad. It was because she hadn't yet forgiven herself. And until that happened, there would be no room for anyone else. Loneliness, once unconscious, was now a choice, a form of silent punishment for everything she'd stopped being. It was on a winter afternoon that their paths crossed for the last time. Sophia was walking through an art exhibition about loss, reconnection, and choices. She was alone, wearing a dark coat, her hair tied up carelessly, and carrying a look that didn't hide her melancholy. She stopped in front of a painting showing a house in ruins with flowers growing through the cracks. She stood there, motionless, until she felt a light tap on her shoulder. She turned slowly and saw Daniel, smiling gently. He, too, was alone. There was something in his gaze that mixed surprise and peace. They talked like two old friends cautiously sharing memories. There was no resentment, but neither was there the urgency of someone wanting to resolve something. It was as if each had understood, in their own way, that everything had been as it should be. They talked about the weather, about life, about books. She told him she was writing. He congratulated her sincerely. And then, as if knowing the moment didn't need to last, they said goodbye with a long hug. It wasn't a hug of longing, nor of desire. It was a hug of forgiveness, of liberation. As they parted, she said, "You were the best part of me." He replied, "You taught me to be the best part of me." And then they went their separate ways, without looking back. After that encounter, Sophia decided to publish her story, not under her real name, but with the intention of reaching those who, like her, have been on the other side of a wrong choice. The book didn't become a bestseller, but it found its audience. She received letters and messages from people who saw themselves in her words, who found in her a painful but necessary mirror. This helped her understand that, while she could never fix the past, she could do something useful with it. Daniel, for his part, continued building his new life with Clara. They adopted a dog, moved apartments, and began planning a long trip through the south of the country. He allowed himself to be happy. Not out of guilt, but out of deservedness. And every night, when he went to bed, he knew he'd done everything he could to save the love he once had. He didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because it became impossible to continue. And that freed him. The moral dilemma arose not from the breakup itself, but from the reflection that followed. Sophia came to be seen by many as the villain, and by others as someone in the process of redemption. Daniel, admired for his serene demeanor, was also questioned. Could he have fought harder? But he knew, and those who truly knew him also knew, that he fought until there was nothing left. The greater dilemma, however, was hers. Because understanding that she hurt someone she only wanted to love hurts. But knowing that she lost him forever because of it, destroys. And this weight, not even time completely alleviates. Each followed their own path of dealing with what happened. Daniel found peace. Sophia sought purpose. And both carried scars that, while they didn't hurt every day, would never disappear. Their story didn't have a traditional happy ending. But it did have a true ending. And sometimes, that's all that remains. Because not every love story ends with reunions. Some end with silence, with forgiveness, with learning. And this kind of ending can also be impactful, when you understand that loving someone doesn't guarantee they'll stay. You have to care. You have to listen. You have to be there. Now, there was only one chapter left. Not to rewrite what was, but to close with dignity what still remained. One last gesture, one last decision, one last choice. Not to return to what was. But to prove, perhaps for the first time, that you understood the lesson. Because sometimes, the only way to love, is to let go. Sophia didn't return home after that hug. She walked aimlessly, crossing streets and thoughts with the slowness of someone who wanted to get nowhere. She could still smell him on her clothes, the warmth of the touch that no longer belonged to her, and that phrase that still echoed in her mind, "You taught me to be the best part of myself." There was no hurt in his voice. There was no irony. Only maturity, a kind of painful wisdom only acquired after losing something precious and surviving. This was the abyss that now separated her from Daniel. He had learned, she was only now beginning to understand. The world moved on, people bumped into her on the sidewalk as if she were invisible, but within her something new was being born, a painful but necessary acceptance. For the first time, she no longer felt anger toward herself, nor hope for a new beginning. She felt a responsibility, almost a mission, to become worthy of the love she once received, even if she would never get it back. A few days later, sitting alone at a literary event, she heard Daniel's name announced as a guest author. She had gone by chance, unaware he would be there. Her heart raced, her skin crawled, but she didn't leave. She remained in her chair, motionless, as he took the stage and began to speak. The topic was reconstruction after the end, and it was impossible not to feel that everything there was directed at her, even though he never mentioned her. Daniel spoke calmly, with the firm voice of someone who has already healed inside. He mentioned how long it took to understand that loving wasn't enough, that loving also meant knowing how to let go when love was no longer welcomed. And finally, he said something that remained etched in her mind like an emotional tattoo: sometimes, the right person teaches us everything, except how to keep them. The words came like stabs, but not the kind that hurt out of revenge. They hurt because they were true. And the truth, spoken calmly, hurts more than a scream. After the talk, she waited for everyone to leave. She didn't look for him. She didn't want to invade any more of his space. But before leaving, she discreetly left a small envelope with the event organizers. Inside, a letter. Not to win him back. Not to justify. Just to say thank you. It was a letter written with the maturity that time had brought her, with the weight of the silences she herself created, and with the gratitude of someone who understood that not every love that ends is a failure. Some are just great teachers who come into our lives to break us and teach us how to put ourselves back together better. Meanwhile, Daniel's life blossomed in a simple and beautiful way. His relationship with Clara grew stronger through truth, mutual listening, and the freedom to be exactly who one is. They didn't talk about the past often, not out of fear, but by choice. Clara didn't want to know the details of what had come before her, and Daniel respected that. They focused on the present, on the routine they were building, on plans that didn't need to be grand to be important. Together, they bought a small house in the mountains, with large windows, a backyard full of possibilities, and a kitchen where they cooked on Sundays to the sound of instrumental music. It was a different time. A different rhythm. And, above all, a different Daniel. It was on a quiet afternoon, one of those Sundays, that Clara found something she hadn't expected. While sorting some boxes in the closet, she found an old notebook with Daniel's notes. Opening it, she found pages written with intensity, venting from a time she'd never known. She recognized Sophia's name on one of the pages. She read it out of curiosity, but stopped. Not because she was jealous or uncomfortable, but out of respect. She waited for Daniel to arrive, sat down next to him, and handed him the notebook. "I didn't read it all. I just opened it by accident. But I think this still means something to you." He smiled, stared at the notebook for a few seconds, and then replied, "It did. Today, it's just part of the journey." Clara hugged him without saying anything else. She didn't demand an explanation, didn't want to know details. She knew who he was now. And that was enough. That same week, Daniel received Sophia's letter. He recognized the handwriting on the envelope before even opening it. He took a deep breath before breaking the seal. As he read it, he felt a lump in his throat, but also a strange peace. The letter asked for nothing. It was an apology and a thank you. It spoke of the lessons learned, of the silent nights, of the dreams that still came from time to time, but now no longer hurt so much. And, at the end, a short sentence: "Thank you for loving me when I didn't know how to love myself. Today, I know. And I owe you that." Daniel folded the letter carefully, put it in the same box where the objects that had marked his past were, and smiled. Not with joy, but with understanding. Sophia had finally understood. And with that, he could move on even more lightly. Sophia, for her part, didn't expect an answer. She understood it wasn't about Daniel anymore, but about her. She began giving lectures on conscious relationships, on presence, on how everyday choices define the course of a love. She spoke with authority because she had experienced the extreme of absence. And, over time, she became a reference for many women who, like her, needed to wake up before losing what mattered most. She transformed her pain into service. Her guilt into teaching. And her lost love into fuel to help others avoid making the same mistakes. A year later, Daniel and Clara were married in a small ceremony, surrounded by loved ones. Daniel's speech was brief but profound. He said that love only makes sense when cultivated with presence, and that today he promised not perfection, but truth. Clara, moved, responded with a smile that said more than any words. In the audience, among the discreet guests, a woman watched from afar. Sophia. Invited by Clara, not Daniel. Clara understood that the cycle would only end when all the ties were undone. Sophia went with a heavy heart, but serene. She watched from afar, wept softly, and gave a standing ovation when the couple kissed. There was no pain. Only gratitude. Leaving the ceremony, she sat for a few minutes on a garden bench, feeling the wind brush against her face. A young woman approached and asked if she was okay. Sophia smiled and replied, "I am." Finally. The girl left, and Sophia remained there, looking up at the sky, wondering if somewhere, at that very moment, someone was making the same mistake she once did. And she hoped, from the bottom of her heart, that this person still had time to return. Because not everyone does. She didn't. And this would be her memory, but also her legacy. The certainty that, despite everything, she had learned. Even if the price was losing someone who only wanted to stay. Life went on as if nothing had happened, as if people's intimate dramas and silent breakdowns had no bearing on the continuous movement of the world. But within each of them, something had changed forever. Daniel, now married, experienced genuine peace for the first time, not the peace forced by trying to please, to maintain, to endure, but the kind that comes from living in coherence with what you feel, with who you are. He woke every day without fear of silence, without fear of not being seen. Clara was confirmation that love doesn't have to be noisy to be intense, doesn't have to be chaotic to be true. Together, they built a life based on mutual listening, respect, and constant care. Daniel no longer needed to write to make himself understood. He was understood in her gaze, in her gestures, in the way she waited for him to finish speaking. And yet, there were days when he found himself remembering the past. Not with longing, but with respect for the pain that shaped him. He knew that without that crooked path, he might never have understood what it was like to be truly loved. Sophia also followed. But her path was longer, rougher. She continued giving lectures, writing articles, receiving emotional messages from people who found in her words the strength to avoid making the same mistakes. At one of these lectures, a woman approached her with teary eyes and said she had ended a toxic relationship after hearing her words, because she understood that love isn't about keeping someone trapped, but about knowing when they're hurting and having the courage to let go. Sophia hugged that woman tightly and, for a moment, saw in her eyes the version of herself that had once begged for someone to wake her up. It was there, in the transformation of others, that she found meaning in what she had experienced. Even if she would forever carry the scar of her own guilt. Even if she would never again experience a love like it. Daniel's forgiveness had freed her body, but it was the forgiveness she gave herself that freed her soul. And that, though belated, was all that remained. Their final reunion didn't come in the form of a conversation or an embrace. It came in a dedication. Years later, with 3 books already published, Daniel was invited to participate in a documentary about contemporary writers. He accepted reluctantly, more out of respect for the audience he had built than vanity. During filming, he mentioned a line written in his diary years earlier: "Those who love but don't care, one day watch the one who only wanted to stay leave." The phrase was featured in the documentary's promotional campaign. When Sophia saw it plastered on billboards, in magazines, and in interviews, she felt a pang in her chest. Not out of regret, this was already an old acquaintance, but because she finally understood that their story had become a reference for thousands of people. She was no longer just an ex-partner. She was part of a larger message, a memory transformed into a lesson. What she didn't know was that, in the first special edition of Daniel's best-selling book, there was a new, silent dedication written on a hidden page before the introduction. It read, "To the one who taught me that loving is not enough, you have to stay." This page didn't exist in the conventional versions, only in the limited edition released for collectors. One of the copies reached her through a well-known publisher. She read the dedication and cried like she hadn't cried in a long time. For the first time, it wasn't out of guilt, nor pain, but out of gratitude. Because, in that small, hidden gesture, she understood that even after everything, something noble remained between them, the truth. And, above all, the knowledge that the destruction caused by betrayal doesn't define who is gone forever, it only shows who one chose to be in that moment. And there is still time to rebuild what's left of oneself. Daniel and Clara remained steadfast. They experienced the loss of a family member, faced financial crises, and dealt with the differences that life imposes, but always hand in hand, with honesty. There was never any obligation to perfection between them. There was only a mutual desire to continue growing together, even through their failures. One night, Clara, while washing the dishes, asked if he still wrote about the past. He replied with a calm smile that he now wrote about the present. And she, drying her hands, hugged him from behind and whispered, "Thank you for waiting for someone who saw you." Daniel closed his eyes and, in that instant, knew he had made the right choices. Sophia, for her part, never fell in love again with the same intensity. But she learned to love differently. She loved her solitude. She loved the purpose she built. She loved the people she helped. One day, while walking through a bookstore, she saw a young woman reading her first book, and upon noticing her crying, she wanted to approach her. But she didn't. She left in silence, her heart warmed by the certainty that her pain was not in vain. She transformed ruin into a bridge. And that was more than she could have imagined when all seemed lost. Their story ended, but its impact continued to reverberate in other bodies, other lives, other relationships. Because betrayals aren't just about people. They're about choices. And the choices we make when faced with the possibility of hurting someone say a lot about who we are. Sophia chose silence, distance, and carelessness. Daniel chose dignity, waiting, and then leaving. And Clara chose to love someone with scars without trying to erase them. Each had their own path, their own pain, their own chance at redemption. Over time, the story that was once theirs alone became a symbol. And symbols, when well interpreted, have the power to transform lives. Daniel's pain taught men not to nullify themselves for fear of loss. Sophia's mistake taught women not to confuse love with guaranteed presence. Clara's love taught that it is possible to rebuild even amidst the rubble. But, above all, this story taught something that should be obvious, but that many still forget: those who love, care. Those who love, listen. Those who love, remain. And if it isn't like this, it isn't love, it's attachment, it's fear, it's vanity. Comment below what you thought of this story. Which character touched you the most? Have you ever experienced something similar? Your opinion is very important to us. And if you haven't subscribed yet, take advantage now, because on this channel you'll find thought-provoking stories that tear and sow the soul of those who listen. And remember, betrayal destroys. It destroys bonds, respect, affection, stories, and in many cases, even the purest love. Here, we don't romanticize or support any kind of betrayal. Our commitment is to truth, to awareness, and to stories that can provoke reflection, transformation, and, who knows, an awakening in those who still believe that love can endure everything. It can't. Love requires care. And if it isn't cared for, it dies.